I've just uncovered some really disappointing news about my local forest. But before we get to that, here's a question. What does wild camping, trees, climate change, the Vikings, and accusations of government corruption have in common? Well, those are some of the topics we're going to be looking at in this video. And just in case you're here for the first time, my name is Stephen and I make outdoor adventure videos and also sort of videos connected to the outdoors, maybe historical things or bigger issues such as this video today. And I'm currently here in the drippy, rainy Annalong Wood in County Down to talk through these things, but also investigate and see if popular campsites are still left standing after recent clear felling by Forestry and also recent storms. And I want to go back and check out that 200-year-old cottage from one of my previous videos to see if it's also survived. But firstly, what I'm going to do, because there were a lot of demands, is I'm firstly going to give you a little bit of a history of why there are so few trees in Ireland. And then once I've done that, I'm going to talk about the current situation today. I'm going to look at Northern Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, and then I'm going to give you the bad news or the sad news that I found about my local forest. If you talk to the average Irish person today and ask them, why are there so few trees in Ireland? Probably the most common answer that you'll get by a long way is that the English cut them all down to build their ships. But that's not actually true. It's actually only a very small part of the real story, because the fact is, by the time invaders from England turned up in Ireland, the native Irish had already cut down up to 85% of trees on the island. So 15% tree cover left at that point. Around about, say, 600 years ago, there was actually less tree cover in Ireland than is the European average today, which is 39%. It's often said that the ancient Irish were people of the trees, and that is true. They had many special trees of really significant importance, but they also had no problems whatsoever with cutting most of them down. Just before I continue, I feel like I need to pause here for a second and acknowledge something, and that is that this topic of what happened to the trees in Ireland is still really emotive today. It's still really politically relevant in Ireland as well. So I know there are some people after hearing that previous bit will be feeling a bit and angry and annoyed because that's not what you grew up hearing. And that's what I believed until I started to investigate the actual history of why there are no trees in Ireland and then realised, oh, that's only a very small part of the story. So two books that were really helpful in this were A Wild Atlantic Rainforest and Island of Woods. So I'll link those two books down in the description, as well as some other resources if you want to do some other reading. Of course, the question is, why did they cut down so many trees? And the answers are numerous. They were cut down for fuel, to burn in fires and forges, to make tools, to forge metals, that kind of thing. They were used as construction materials, building materials. They were used to build fences, they were used to build homes. They were used to build boats and utensils and furniture and all kinds of things. I mean, wood was the primary construction material here for several thousand years. But the primary reason they cut them down was agriculture, both to grow crops, but more significantly, to raise cattle. Back then, cows were your wealth symbol of the day, your status symbol. They were highly prized. And a lot of these ancient tribes, it seemed like one of their favorite pastimes was conducting cattle raids and stealing cattle from each other. But these cattle required a lot of space, and that meant clearing a lot of trees. One interesting side note about the 80% plus tree coverage that Ireland used to have is that a lot of it, a huge amount of it, used to be rainforest. And there are some patches of that rainforest still left today. And that's something I want to make a future video about. I'm going deep into this part of the forest to try and see if some old 200-year-old buildings have been destroyed by the trees coming down in the storm, and it's not looking good so far. I made it. Oh. So far it's still standing. If that tree had fallen slightly that way, that will be gone. So they're still here, but the question is for how long, because currently the Forest Service is clear felling this forest, and at some point they're probably going to rock through here, and they've got pretty heavy machinery, and I doubt they're going to care what happens to these walls when they rumble through. But this is probably a good place to keep talking about the history. So quickly to recap, the native Irish cut down the majority of the trees from about 3,000 years ago to 1,000 years ago. And around about 1,000 years ago, Ireland got some strange visitors with big pointy horned helmets. They never actually had those, but it was the Vikings. The Vikings turned up in Ireland. They pillaged, they plundered, they did lots of Viking-y things. But one thing they did do is they settled in Ireland. In fact, it was Vikings that actually founded the modern day city of Dublin, and they founded other cities as well, like Waterford. Over time, they basically got assimilated into the population. But the Vikings were the first people from outside Ireland to exploit it for its forests for the purpose of export. The most impressive Viking longship ever found was, I think, 30 meters long, and it was found in the mud at the bottom of a Danish fjord. And that longship was built in Dublin, and it was made primarily from Irish oak. Then around about the 1600s, the invaders from England really start to show up in force and in numbers. They come to Ireland, they take over the land from the natives, they establish plantations here, and then from around the 1600s onwards play a huge role in cutting down that remaining 15% of Ireland's trees. But it wasn't just to make ships. Actually, very few Irish trees ended up in English ships. The majority of the wood was cut down for the reasons it had always been cut down. It was cut down for construction, for building, for fuel. A lot of it was used to make high quality charcoal. It was also exported and used in other countries, used in buildings and cathedrals and houses. A lot of it ended up in oak barrels that went off to Spain. A lot of it was also cut down to deny the native Irish tree cover during warfare. Quite often they'd be outnumbered, so what they would do is guerrilla style attacks. They would retreat into the forests, try to draw the English into the forest, and then they would ambush them. So the English cut down a lot of the forests to stop them being able to do that. The fact is, by the time we get to 1925, Ireland has got 1% of forest cover left. Pretty much the only trees left standing at this point were the ones in land that are really hard to get to or just not suitable for agriculture. And there's a lot of other stuff happening in Ireland at the same time. You had the Irish War of Independence, you had the Irish Civil War, you had Ireland gaining independence, you had the partition of Ireland with Northern Ireland being split off into its own country and remaining part of the UK. Lots of stuff was happening, but it's 2025. Really, there has been the last 100 years to improve things. Not sure I'm supposed to be up here. There's a very big machine over there, but if it starts coming behind me, let me know. So the question is, 100 years later, what is now the current native tree cover across Ireland? Drum roll, please. 2%. 2%. That is a 1%. I'm going to get sap all over my backside. That is a 1% gain in 100 years. But here's the thing. You don't have to plant trees for them to come back. You just leave the land alone. Trees regrow by themselves. And as somebody pointed out, the question today is really not the question of why did all the trees disappear? The real question is, why didn't they grow back? And the answer to that is largely our little cotton balled fluffy friends, the sheep. In Ireland, if you look at the hills are incredibly barren. That's because there's sheep put on those hills, and the sheep eat all the young shoots. Because the fact is, today, the primary purpose of trees is this. Total tree cover, including the native tree cover, is at 11%, but 9% of it are these plantations growing for commercial purposes, and they're harvested every sort of 20 to 50 years and then replanted with more of the same, and the cycle continues. So this is all we really have here. Monoculture plantations planted really close together so that they grow fast and straight, but it means that it cuts out all the light and nothing really grows underneath. And that is simply to meet the demands of the timber industry. But the little guilty secret is that Ireland actually imports 30% of its timber, and this really shocked me. You know all those utility poles that are spread all over the countryside that carry electricity and telecommunications and all of that? You know, long, straight, thin poles, not that thick. You'd think that would be exactly the sort of thing that would be grown locally. Well, the vast majority of those are actually imported from Scandinavia. In fact, in the Republic of Ireland, ESB networks have to import 15,000 of those utility poles per year, every year. So not only are plantations like this bad for biodiversity, they're also really vulnerable to disease. If you plant loads of trees close together that are all the same species and some kind of disease comes in, well, chances are you're going to end up losing the entire forest. Now, I've said this before, but I'm going to say it again. I am not against forestry. We need some way of producing timber for our construction and material and fuel needs and all the other amazing things that we do with wood and that we need it for. We need some way to produce it, because if we don't produce it, we're simply paying someone else to produce it. So we do need forestry, but it's got to be done in some way that when they're cut down doesn't leave these massive barren scars on the landscape. Some way that can work in harmony with nature, with the inherent design that's already there within nature for forests and for trees, the one that's was working successfully before we chopped them all down. And I've been contacted recently by somebody who tells me that there is actually a way of doing forestry that way, and I've been invited to go and have a look for myself. So when that happens, I'm going to make a future video about that. Another problem is that these kinds of monoculture spruce plantations are really vulnerable to storms. The trees don't have particularly deep roots, they're not that strong as they could be, and they're often planted on locations that maybe aren't best suited to them. So when storms rip through, it tends to devastate the forests. That happened to the local forest near me, Tardree, where hundreds, if not thousands of trees were flattened during Storm Éowyn. Part of me hoped this might be a chance to reset, to do things differently, but I found the future plans for the forest and they don't particularly fill me with hope. And we will get to those in just a minute. But next, I'm going to talk about the future plans for forestry in the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland. Last year, this trail was a beautiful avenue of trees. Some of them actually really big and mature, as you can see from the diameter of some of the logs. And today it's like walking through a battlefield. The difference is just crazy. And this is the end result of the forestry practices that have been common here for decades. I'm coming up on the first popular camping spot, and I am actually feeling quite hopeful. And the reason I'm feeling hopeful is that these trees in here, this particular patch, I think are mostly Scots pines. Scots pines are native, and the other thing that I've noticed is very few of these trees have been blown down. Loads of other trees out there, the non-native ones, have been blown down. But let's see. Oh, so that tree's down and that tree's down, and actually if you look at those trees, they're both black. So that's interesting. The only two trees that came down here were diseased or dead. All the other ones, they're all still standing. Not immune to the actions of idiots. That was a nice Scots pine tree. Some absolute sphincter crumb cut that one down. Okay, that's enough of that. Let's go and put a tarp up, get out of this rain, have a cup of coffee, and have a chat about the future. Okay, tell me this. Does anyone else do this? Do you ever go out in the rain and you kind of forget the fact that you're wearing a hood? And then your head just gets wet? Okay, let's talk about the future, and I'm going to try and keep this section short and simple because this could easily be a 30-minute video in of itself. So the situation in the Republic of Ireland is generally looking, at least on paper, more positive there. Forestry is managed by Quilcha, which is a semi-state organisation business, so it's run for profit, that controls 11% of all land in the Republic of Ireland. And Quilcha primarily exists to grow trees to meet the demands and the needs of the timber industry. So over the years, they've mostly just been involved in planting and managing non-native conifer plantations, mostly Sitka spruce. They've been criticised over the years by many different people for some of the ways they do things, and they still get criticised today. Every single time I make a video about trees here, there will be people in the comments criticising Quilcha. And there were other people who contacted me with concerns about how forestry was affecting them in the areas that they live in. So for some people, Quilcha is not a good word. So why am I saying that things are looking more positive in the Republic of Ireland? Well, it's because today it seems like Quilcha is acknowledging the mistakes of the past, and the plans that they say they want to implement for the future do seem really, really positive. They've got big plans to improve recreation in their forests, although there are some issues around access rights that I'm going to be tackling in a future video. But there's lots of good stuff they say they're going to do. Increase biodiversity, trying to offset climate change, lots of good sounding stuff on paper. But the thing is, they do still have that majority focus, at least currently, on the commercial timber industry. And that is where it gets controversial. Probably the most controversial thing they've done in recent years is agree a €200 million deal with a British investment fund into future forestry. And the thing with investment funds is, well, they want a return on their investment and they tend to want it quite quickly. And what type of tree is most likely to give you a quicker return on investment? Well, I'll give you a clue. It's not native woodland. It's important to not forget that this is a €2.3 billion a year industry. The most positive headline figure from Quilcha is that they want to eventually have 50% of their forests managed for nature. So that's 50% no longer going to be cut down, no longer for commercial use. They're going to be for nature. And that sounds great until you ask the question, well, what percentage of that 50% is going to be native woodland? And that's where you can't really get an answer on it. A huge number of conifer plantations are being planted at the minute just to meet carbon capture goals. It's a way that companies are sort of greenwashing the public. They say, like Brewdog is a really good example of that. They said they planted an entire forest to offset all their carbon. The truth is that forest actually ended up dying. It was a bit of a disaster, but a lot of companies are jumping on this idea of planting trees, planting forests to meet those goals, and often they're just more forests like this. So I guess I would say that the situation in the Republic of Ireland currently is messy. And I would like to dig into the detail on that at some point. But I guess at least on paper, they have a plan. They have targets that seem more positive, or at least are moving in a more positive direction. If you're somebody who has any knowledge on this, and I'm sure some of you do, please feel free to let me know down in the comments, and that'll help me with future videos. The situation in Northern Ireland, on the other hand, feels like typically there is no cohesive plan. The Forestry Service here is once again a government department that exists to meet the needs of the timber industry, but they don't really have any real official public presence or website the way Quilcha has, where they sort of lay down all their goals and aims. They simply say that they're following UK guidelines on what they're supposed to do with regards to the future. So it's all really just a bit vague, but there's been some stuff that seems kind of good. Back in 2000, a commitment was made that we are going to plant 9,000 hectares of new woodland by 2030. And this is something that financial grants were made available for landowners to set aside land that could be used for this. Which sounds good until you look at the detail. Only 5% of those trees need to be native trees, And up to 80% of the trees in one of those areas can be a single species. So it was just paying people to create more monoculture plantations like this. And I can speak from my own experience in that it really feels like Northern Ireland's Forestry Service don't care that much about recreation, apart from a few key sites. My local forest of Tardree, I can remember as a child, there was a really well-maintained car park, there was picnic areas, barbecue areas, there was a nice stone hut that you could use, and the trails were well-maintained. Today, the trails are a mess. They only get maintained where forestry needs access. There's places where the trails have sunk into the ground, there's massive holes in them. It's just really unpleasant to walk on now in places. And it's not that this is just some remote forest that hardly anybody visits. There's about probably actually more than 100,000 people live within a 10-mile radius of that forest. So it gets a lot of visitors. I feel like this is a little bit of accidental partridge. Aha! Recently, they've begun clear felling Tardree. Loads and loads of trees cut down, massive bald patches now in the forest. But the other thing that happened here was Storm Éowyn blew through and knocked down hundreds, if not thousands of trees in this forest. And a lot of people, including myself, when I made a previous video about this, commented to say that maybe this is a chance to reset. Maybe this is a chance to do something different here, a blank slate. But then someone sent me a link. And that link was to a website that details exactly what the plans are for a lot of forests here in Northern Ireland. And I found the plans for Tardree up to 2038. And here it is. Those bright green and the dark orange areas, they're all going to be replanted in monoculture Sitka spruce or Norway spruce. So they're increasing the number of species that they're planting. And we'll find out why in a minute. Those brown areas are being planted with Scots pine, which is native, but it's still monoculture, it's not mixed. And then those teeny tiny light orange areas are going to be native woodland, which I'm guessing might be mixed species, although also it might not be. So really here, it's just going to be more of the same. A forest in a cycle that mostly prioritizes commercial usage. So I'm not going to see this place change in my lifetime. But it's not negative in all areas. Some areas are actually looking quite positive. There's Glenara Forest Park, for instance, now has a huge area which is designated for native woodland and a wider variety of trees. And Glenara is a really popular tourist destination, and I kind of wonder if maybe that's why it's getting a little bit of upfront special treatment. Because if you move off to the side, you can then see that the areas away from where most people walk, well, they're just going to be replanted once again, mostly in Sitka spruce. If you dig a little bit deeper on that website, you'll encounter the real reason for the Forest Service starting to plant a wider range of species. If you click onto the species diversity button, what have you got at the top? The name of a sawmill. So the reason they're diversifying and planting those Norway spruce and some other species is simply to meet the demands of the timber industry. So really, that is what drives the agenda and still drives the agenda when it comes to the trees in Northern Ireland. Money. I've really struggled to know how to end this video, and I think that's because there's just so much uncertainty wrapped up in this. There's no guarantees. But I do kind of feel that maybe the solution isn't to try and get commercial forestry to start looking out for the interests of native woodland. Maybe the solution is that you need, I don't know, an organisation whose primary aim is to improve the native woodland within a country, and then you have commercial is run as a separate organisation. Maybe they work together, but I feel like any time there are vast sums of money involved, there's always going to be a compromise somewhere. And the commercial interests are always going to win out, and it's going to be a constant battle. But as I hinted at earlier, I have been contacted by somebody who says that there is a way to do forestry that will allow for high quality timber, and it will allow for native trees to come back and return as well. I'm a little bit skeptical about that, but I have arranged to meet this person, and if that turns out to not be a dead end, I hope at some point to make a video about that. So maybe there's a tiny little bit of hope for the future, who knows? But for me, I think what's the big tragedy here is that even if everything was positive, large areas of native woodland take hundreds of years to return. So there isn't a single person alive today who will ever live to see the return of significant quantities of native Irish woodland. That is just sad. But I don't like to end on a downer, so maybe we just need to kind of accept the situation, make the best of it, and try and do things that'll make changes so that someday somebody might be able to enjoy those things. You know, if, you know, the world hasn't ended.